Their eschatology is very much the tailspin opposite. All right, it's quite literally out of the pit of hell when it comes to that, more so than any other religion. And I'm blunt. I'm saying it. Even their idea of a prophet who will arise up to kind of unite their people and whatnot near the end, we see that in Revelations, the false prophet. There are all those little connections there. So while there was definitely a portion of the Arab fight against Israel that was in part secular, there was a growing, and always, even amongst that, there was still a lot of religious rhetoric. But from pretty much the 40s and on, there was always a growing and more religious-centric aspect to this opposition to Israel. And again, as you see, even in Hamas's founding charter, when they became Hamas as we know them today in 1988, that was part and parcel of it. So that's going to be a backdrop that filters into a lot of what we're going to go over today. But we're going to start with maybe a nicer thing. Peace with Egypt. All right? On March 26, 1979, Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty. It took a lot of work, but eventually they were able to come to the negotiations. You'll remember that at the end of the Yom Kippur War, when Israel was invaded by Egypt and Syria, that they did have some, it seemed as if they were winning there at the beginning, but at the end, Israel was able to kind of push them back to somewhat of a stalemate. So no one really made a full win, but on a moral level, for the Arabs, it was a win because they weren't like full-on defeated or anything like that. In any case, Israel still had the bulk of the Sinai Peninsula. They still had the Gaza Strip and the West Bank due to the 1967 war. And there was finally some kind of talks of trying to attempt peace. And in exchange for peace, Egypt recognized, it was one of the first to recognize Israel as an actual state, to open up diplomacy with them. And then, as an exchange, Israel would give them back the Sinai Peninsula, because reality was Israel didn't really want it anyway. They never had a goal for that. There wasn't some attempt to take over the world or anything. It was just their wars for defense and all that happened as a result. So they would end up giving that back. Now, unfortunately, though, because of a lot of that mentality we were just talking about, the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, would be assassinated in 1981, due specifically to his making peace with Israel. A lot of, not 100% of very individual Muslim was against this, but there was definitely a good chunk of them who were very mad about this, and especially in Egypt. He became very unpopular for it. He was hoping to just make peace because after decades of war, as people who've ever fought in war can say, it's not pretty. And some people, eventually that affects them to the point where they just want to see peace finally. For better or worse, he paid for that with his life. Begin was the Israeli PM who made the deal also with him. Oddly enough, he was one of the commanders of that Irgun group, militia group I told you about. That was before 1948. He would become part of the IDF and eventually work his way up to becoming a prime minister. But he was a part of that initial group, which you will recall I had said was similar to the Zealots in a way, pre-1948 and the things they did and whatnot. But even him by this time was like, we just want peace. Israel, over this next decade plus, we're going to see this aspect with Israel where a lot of their leadership and a lot of people voting them, they're tired. To this point, they have gone decade to decade without a war. They're tired and they just want to finally find a way to make peace, which they truly attempted over this next bit of time that we're going to be going over. It is before this, in the 70s, and then during this, that another person of interest would gain influence and power within the Arabs in Israel, or specifically the Palestinian Arabs. And his name was Yasser Arafat. All right, he becomes a pretty big figure. He was a leader of that PLO, that Palestinian Liberation Organization, and eventually what it kind of evolved into, which is the PA in the 90s and to today. But he was very much a terrorist mastermind. He a military guy through and through, and he learned how to play the politics of the world, especially for the Western world, and the idea of doublespeak. Who here knows what doublespeak means? Anybody? I don't mind if you want to throw it out there. I'm okay with that. Yeah, does anyone know what that means? Yep. Yep, 1984. If you've ever read George Orwell's 1984, this idea of doublespeak is a kind of speaking out of both sides of your mouth. You say phrases, you say certain words, but you literally are not meaning them. You mean the exact opposite. You get a person like Yasser Arafat, which we'll see later on, becoming a very big political guy and becoming the face and head of the PLO, and working to try to make peace, but with a dagger behind his back. And we'll get to that for sure. All the while, with all that, organizing terrorist attacks, so on and so forth. And it must be also understood that this was that the spiritual evil, if you will, that Hitler, going back to that real quick, Hitler had done with everything he did in Germany. This was still the continuation of it, because Yasser Arafat, within the PLO, himself was a big, I guess you can say fan, a continuation of the ideology and ideas of the Mufti of Jerusalem that we had talked about before, Hussein. This guy who had worked a little bit with Hitler and whatnot. Yasser Arafat was known for passing along with a lot of the PLO, and we talked a little bit about that Russian propaganda last week as well, passing along a lot of Mein Kampf, making Arab translations, and making it required reading for the leadership, the up-and-coming leadership within the PLO, again, within the areas of Palestine, West Bank and Gaza, as they were calling it. And so everything that would start to develop and continue was very much on a spiritual sense, a continuation of what Hitler himself had done, literally using the same ideas and ideology. As a matter of fact, even the idea of seeing a swastika utilized in a lot of symbols within the Arab world from this time on became something you would see, because that's exactly what they were channeling. They were channeling the same hate that so soaked up Hitler. Because again, this is a spiritual war at the end of the day, more than it is a physical one. All the physical stuff is just the reality, the spiritual world spilling into our physical reality, if you will. All right. And so, to this end, there was also something that was created, and this was in 1968. It was called the Palestinian National Charter. And it was during this time with the PLO and whatnot that they kind of came together to make I guess you can say a manifesto of sorts, various articles stating their issues they had with the Zionist states of Israel, as they called it, and these aggressors who came in, the foreign aggressors. And in it, it didn't pop up. There we go, sorry. In it, it would say this, in Article 21, the Arab Palestinian people, and I, again, want to note, they know it was Arabs, they know who they were. The idea of this, we had talked about this last week, it was during that time in the late 60s that the idea of developing a unique Palestinian people like this started to come into play when it was never a thing before. But here they started to say, Article 21, the Arab Palestinian people expressing themselves by the armed Palestinian revolution reject all solutions which are substitutes for the total liberation of Palestine, and reject all proposals aiming at the liquidation of the Palestinian problem or its internationalization. What does that mean? Anything that was less than the whole state of Israel being destroyed and given over to create a state of Palestine, an Arab state, anything less than that was a non-starter. There was no middle ground, there was no compromise to be had. In their own founding documents, be it in the Palestinian National Charter, be it in Hamas, we're going to look at that, one of their things that says something similar. From the beginning, this was always the goal. We had made a mention about the fact that in 1948, 2 states were created by the UN, a Jewish state and an Arab state. One declared independence. The other one decided to go straight into war and then lost itself completely. Whether you think there should be 2 states or not, my point is that there is no argument to sit there and say that Israel from the get-go was trying to take over the whole thing. Were there individuals, we talked about that in the first one, were there individuals within the Zionist movement that would have loved to have done that? Sure. Was it them as a whole? And more specifically, when they made their government and they went from there on, is that what they attempted to do? No. But the other side, from the very start, always wanted the total annihilation of a state of Israel. They wouldn't allow it. Their own founding documents over the years would say as much. So, as we, again, going back to the 80s portion, I'm going to be going back and forth a little bit here. we have the beginnings of what was called the Intifada's. And from pretty much the 80s on, 80s, 90s, going into 2000s, you would have waves of violence that were pushed in by various terrorist factions of the Arab world against the Israeli population. All right? They would fight against what they saw as an occupation of a foreign army. And, if they had only ever attacked military targets, maybe one could say, okay, fair enough in a secular sense. But problem was they specifically, intentionally attacked way more than that, and many times almost only this, civilians. Whether it was schools, school buses, women, children, men, etc., it's what they went after. They would rarely go after purely military targets. And unlike the wars before that Israel found itself in, it was now finding itself in a very unconventional style warfare. Because, again, it wasn't just specifically their military targets being hit, it was all their people being directly attacked. This was terrorism. The whole point was to bring terror into the population, to scare them into capitulation, all right, to force deals by pure evil and barbaric acts. It is during that time, during the first Intifada, which was 1987, and would last for a couple of years, it was in that time that we would get the Hamas as we know it today. The origins of Hamas start with a group that was known for making clinics, soup kitchens, and things like that. Were very popular. They got donation money. Israel actually helped give them donation money because it was a charity group, and Israel was very big into trying to do things, hoping that, hey, if we do things and help with charity groups, maybe this will help bring peace. Fortunately, the founders of this group would go on to then create Hamas in 1988. And in their charter, specifically Article 11, they have a portion where they say this: the Islamic resistance movement believes that the land of Palestine is an Islamic waqf, and I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day. It or any part of it should not be squandered. It or any part of it should not be given up. Neither a single Arab country nor all Arab countries, neither king or president, nor all the kings and presidents, neither any organization nor all of them, be they Palestinian or Arab, possess the right to do that. Palestine is an Islamic waqf, a land consecrated by Muslim generations until Judgment Day. Matter of fact, we'll read the other part before I say that. Yeah, okay. It continues that this is the law governing the land of Palestine in the Islamic Sharia law. And the same goes for any land the Muslims have conquered by force, because during the times of the Islamic conquest, the Muslims consecrated these lands to the Muslim generations till the Day of Judgment. Last week I had I told you guys I was going to mention this a little bit this week. During the Q&A, I forget who had asked it, but we ended up discussing this idea of that any lands that during the Muslim Empire, any land that was conquered during that, theologically, for the Muslim is understood to be, you could say a sense in the Holy Land, but it's this idea of that's land that's been consecrated, it's land that is ours, and because we've taken it by force at some point in history, Allah has given it to us forever. But that's not specific to the Holy Land. It's not specific to Saudi Arabia. That is, the whole Muslim empire was 2 to almost 3 times the size of the Roman Empire. It was all northern Africa. It was Spain. It was Portugal. It was all the areas around Greece. It was modern-day Turkey, obviously, the Middle East, all the way up into the portions next to India. All of that is considered for them that. And for a lot of these guys, this is why there are political pundits out there who will say, listen, if and when they take out Israel, eventually they're going to come for us. The reason they say that is because these other lands, they believe, are theirs. Israel's just the starting point because it's got some of their more holiest sites. And it's right there. And they're not about to allow Jews to have their own state around them. That's just, anathema. But this is what Hamas stated in its charter, which aligns a lot already with some of the other things we have shown. So it's not specific to Hamas. But yeah, they would go on to start slowly becoming a bigger and bigger figure and thorn in the side of Israel going into the 90s, and most specifically in the 2000s. And we'll look at that again after we go over some more slides in the interim. So, something really cool happened, though, during all this time. What was one of the whole founding ideas of Israel? Was that, again, it's going to be a Jewish state for the safety of Jews. But one of the goals was Jews around the world would have a place they could flee to, a place that would take them in. Unlike in times like World War II or other times where you had Jews who fled and nations said no. You had, okay, cool. You had Jews, sorry, that distracted me. You had Jews who fled in boats. There was that cruise ship that I had mentioned to you guys a while back where came to the United States. It went to Cuba, went to a couple other places. They all said no. It came to the United States. We said no. Eventually got taken back, and all those people found themselves in camps in the Holocaust, even though they had gone off continental Europe. So Israel had always made it a point saying, if you're a Jew, and wherever you are, and the secular Israel said, we're going to go beyond rabbinic tradition here. If you fit the definition of Nazis on what they called a Jew, which was, I think it was one grandparent or great-grandparents, even if you have just one, we will take you in. Because if that was good enough for Hitler, it's going to be good enough for us, and we're going to protect our own. That was the point. Why am I bringing all this up? Because in the 80s, with everything else that was happening, Israel did not forget its mission of what it was made to do, what its founding fathers had intended for it. And so, despite everything else that was going on, they were doing what they could to do rescue missions throughout the world in places where Jews were finding themselves in persecution. All right? This is where a certain particular group found itself in the biggest rescue missions that Israel, that we know of at least, committed, which was the Ethiopian Jews, okay, who were in portions of modern-day Ethiopia, but specifically in Sudan, where they had found themselves were coming over heavy, heavy persecution during this time. Ultimately, in the 80s, there were 3 separate rescue missions, the first and the third being the biggest ones where over 90% of them would be saved. By the end of it, somewhere upwards of 23,000 Ethiopian Jews were saved in top secret missions that Israel committed during that time, mainly through airlifts. They gutted out their massive cargo planes, took all the seats and whatnot, and would airlift hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 in any one batch to rescue these Ethiopian Jews. And obviously there's a picture of one of them. It's actually interesting. The first time around, the Sudan leadership, Sudan's presidency and whatnot, actually kind of knew of it and were going to allow it as long as they kind of got the Jews out of their hands, so to speak, because they knew that their population was having a big issue with them. And they said, you know what, go ahead, take them. We're not going to make a big issue. But when some of the stuff was leaked out during this first attempt in 81, it was leaked out what was happening, and a lot of the Arab world pressured Sudan to stop that from happening. Why? People fleeing. They're not doing anything to you. Because that meant more Jews in Israel. It meant more people that eventually they would probably have to fight or deal with. That's why. And Sudan did put a stop to it because of the pressure, so eventually Israel, again, continued in their third and final one, which was the biggest, which was in 1991, involved itself over 14,000 of those 23,000 plus Ethiopian Jews were saved going over. And in some cases, as they're being shot at, getting into the planes and whatnot. There's a good movie that references some of these events. Oh, what's it called? Sorry, I didn't have it in my notes. It just came to mind right now. The Red Sea Hotel? I think it has Chris Evans in it, if you know who he is. And it's a movie actually talking about the true events of what happened in the part of the rescue mission. I don't remember if that one's specific to the 1991. I think that was earlier on. But in any case, Israel would do this. Israel would find ways to get Jews from other places throughout the world to bring them there when they were under massive persecution. And as always, left an open door, for better and worse. I'll explain the worst part in a moment. For any Jews who come under persecution. The worst part, what do I mean by that? And this has led to some conspiracy theories, and I get it. But Israel, again, said anybody who comes under persecution, who's Jewish, we will take in. There had been a long history of Jews under legal persecution. all right, whether it was France in the early 1900s, 1800s, 1700s, and whatnot. So even when people today who are Jewish find themselves, whether they are or not, actually committing crimes, coming under certain legal issues, if they're Jewish, Israel will take them in. Because there has been a history of people who were Jewish, who weren't doing things bad, finding themselves under the law because they were Jewish, not because they did anything bad. So Israel has a very blanket thing for that. They don't necessarily do a case-by-case basis. I think they should. That's just me. But I also understand why, because there's a long history of the law being used to persecute Jews and set them up for things. Obviously, that doesn't mean every case is that. Again, for better or worse, they do that. So, all that was happening in the 80s. This leads to, like I said, that first intifada. There's violence erupting. This is, in the 70s, you had the oil embargo and everything that happened. So the Western world is like getting to the point where they're like, listen, this is messing with our money. This is messing with the economies of the world. There's a lot of resources that come from the Middle East. So there's more and more pressure being put for something to happen to finally bring this all to an end. All right? Not to mention, just also in Israel, the people, are having a lot of issues with the stuff that's happening. In this time, for all intents and purposes, they have been occupying the West Bank and Gaza at this point for a while. That peace treaty with Egypt, where they gave the Sinai Peninsula back, Israel wanted to give Gaza back. Egypt said no. It's interesting. Egypt said no to that. You can look that up. Egypt said no. Why? My personal opinion. All right, so this is just my opinion. This is my speculation, for whatever it's worth. Egypt was already having problems, just like Jordan did with some of individually Palestinian groups. All right? Jordan, remember, they had that issue. They had a little civil war. They kicked out the PLO from their areas into Lebanon. We had talked about that last week. Egypt was like, we ain't going to have that problem. You guys can keep that. We don't want to deal with it. Even though all those initial wars in the beginning were so that they can, make an Arab state, come there for their fellow Arabs, and so on and so forth. When they really had the chance to do it, they still said no. And I'm sure there's some level of, hey, this is going to be a thorn we're going to leave in your side. I'm sure there was some level of that. I can't say that 100%, but I'm very confident about this idea that they were like, no, we already have problems with a group called the Muslim Brotherhood. We don't need another group that we got to deal with. We saw what happened in Jordan. We're not doing that. We want our Sinai Peninsula back. That's a problem we're not going to deal with. So they didn't. It was after that that Israel said, all right, I guess if we're going to keep having it, we'll allow people to start settling in it. Because to that point, they didn't really allow, people would, but it wasn't, state-sponsored. They did start to sponsor settlements of Jews during the 70s and then up, going into Gaza to settle, make villages, make towns. Some of them going to old places that used to be Jewish towns back in the day. In any case, with all of that, and then the terrorist attacks and everything that was happening, there was more pressure within Israel, within its own, remember, they're a democratic nation, so voting, politics, and all the good and bad that comes with that. You got people who just want peace. Again, they're tired. A decade hasn't gone by without war and conflict. Every generation has had blood spilt in some form or fashion. They want peace, and they're tired of it. So eventually, a full-on, even in spite of all of this other things happening, the violence being perpetrated. I can't speak today. I apologize. Thank you. They started to push for it. Plus, again, that pressure coming from the Western world, so on and so forth. So we get to what is eventually called the Oslo Accords. All right? And it was meant to pave the way towards peace in the Middle East. All right? It was the start of a process of bringing back, all right, a two-state solution and moving forward with it. Now, like I say up there, despite an honest yet, in my opinion, naive attempt on the side of Israel, they really were trying to push forward with this. The terrorist attacks didn't really stop. They actually would continue throughout the 90s to only get progressively worse. Yet even then, Israel followed through with various points that the Oslo Accords had put up. The Oslo Accords started making like benchmarks, if you will, that, hey, by this time, the PLO will establish some type of government that can eventually take over. By this time, Israel, you'll start withdrawing from certain areas, allow them to establish themselves, things like that. That was the kind of setup that happened in the Oslo Accords. Israel continued to try to do its part towards that. Eventually, we get this famous picture of Bill Clinton, Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin, and Arafat, where Bill Clinton was one of the main guys overseeing the Oslo Accords, brought them together in this handshake that they have. These two guys would end up winning Nobel Peace Prizes for this truly historic attempt. Unfortunately, again, it was, thank you, I appreciate that. Unfortunately, though, like I said earlier, Yasser Arafat was the type of guy that would tell you peace, love, happiness, but with a knife filled with blood behind him in his hands. Because while all this was happening, like I said, those terrorist attacks, did they stop? Israel was asking for that to happen as a part of this process. No, they got worse. They got worse. And you know what? Some of the religious within Israel decided they have had enough. And unfortunately, there was an Israeli, and I'm pointing at one particular moment, there's a few of them, who would go into Hebron, that place where there was that massacre of Jews that I told you about. Well, he would go there. This is now barely any Jews there. It's in the West Bank area. And he went there as a gunman and gunned down, I think, I don't remember what the number was. I want to say it was upwards of 50 some Muslims, including women and children. It was a terrible thing. It was a terrible thing. So it's not as if there were only terrorists on one side. I said this before. It's not. The difference was, this wasn't state-sponsored. The difference was Israel went and got him, prosecuted him, and threw his butt in jail. That was the difference. You never saw that on the other side. In fact, on the other side, the people, usually they were suicide bombers, or they would do it and they would get killed. They were held up as martyrs. They would have full-on vigils. They were considered by the state heroes. They would be funded. Their family would be given aid. Very different. The Western world at that time was still not getting it. And to be fair, I think for a lot of them, they weren't aware of this stuff. They were just beginning to see it. But that's like, nah, that can't be right. Well, Shimon Peres, Rabin would be himself actually assassinated as well, the Israeli prime minister. He would be assassinated by a religious law student there in Israel. His name was Shimon Peres. Not Shimon Peres. That would be the PM that would take after him. But he would be assassinated and killed not long after these accords had been started. Again, there were those in Israel who were heavily, heavily against this. Didn't want it. I'll skip over that part. That's fine. No, I'll say it. All right, so eventually a centrist would be elected in Israel known as Barak. And he would finally be able to get the troops out of Lebanon. I don't remember if you recall last week we talked about the fact that Israel went into southern Lebanon due to the PLO and eventually the beginnings of Hezbollah to establish a foothold there to keep them from shooting rockets into the northern area. For them, that was very much their Vietnam War. They had been stuck there for a long time, never really actually won. And this was a big turning point. While there was a withdrawal, and it was an understandable withdrawal, regardless of that aspect, they never actually got to do what they are intending to do, which was destroy the PLO and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. For the Arab terrorists around the world, this was like, this is the first time Israel has actually lost. This was an emboldening thing for them because they started to realize, conventional warfare, we weren't winning at that, but now they haven't actually been able to get us. We've been doing this guerrilla terrorist-style warfare, and they haven't been able to stop us. And that emboldened them big time, and that was a big part of what was happening here in the 90s and eventually what would continue to happen because, Israel never was able to finish this. And that's Netanyahu, Bibi, was around during this time, and he was heavily against these peace accords because he felt like he understood that Yasser Arafat was a man with a knife behind his back. And for better or worse, whatever you think of him today, and I have my own issues with him, but one thing I do understand is this. He saw these attempts to make peace and what the fruit of it would end up being, and we're about to get to that fruit in a moment. This was very much why he's the way he is now, where he's like, no, there is no quarter. I don't care what it costs. We will destroy Hamas. Because he understands that this type of thing with other groups has happened, and it's a cycle. He wants to stop it. Whether it can actually be stopped or not, but at least you can understand the mentality he has, and that's the only reason I bring that up. So eventually, we got to what was called the Camp David Accords. The Oslo Accords were beginning to fall apart because, again, of that violence that was erupting. And so eventually, with Bill Clinton helping to lead this, they came to Camp David, the Israeli leaders, Yasser Arafat, and it was very much skipping to the end game. And Israel said, listen, you know what? We've been trying to meet these benchmarks. You guys are struggling with it. How about we just get to the end, and this is what we'll offer? They offered them a complete withdrawal of all Israeli forces, people, etc., from 97% of the West Bank, all of Gaza, and they even offered up East Jerusalem to be the capital of a Palestinian state. All right? A good chunk of, maybe not a good chunk, but there were definitely Palestinian negotiators who were like, oh yeah, this is a good deal. But what happened? What was the answer? Yasser Arafat said no. It baffled Bill Clinton. It baffled the Israeli leadership at the time and whatnot too, because it was like, we just gave you a golden platter where we said, hey, we'll just do all this, we'll come out, all we ask is that there be peace. In return, all Arafat had to do was say, all right, this will be the end of it, we can dust off, and there's no more back and forth. But he said no. Yet again, whether you agree there should be 2 states or not, that's besides the point. Yet again, a 2-state solution was proposed, in this case specifically from Israel. And what did the other side do? They said no. Because why? What did we talk about? What was that Hamas charter? What was that charter from 1968, the Palestinian National Convention? Even if it's just 1% that is not given over, it's a no. That is the mentality. When you hear today some, usually younger Muslims, or let's say even people who aren't Muslim, but they have a lot of sympathy for the Muslim movements over there and whatnot, and they say, oh, Israel's never wanted peace. Like, no, they have. Multiple times they've tried, all right? Multiple times they tried. Oh, if only there was a 2-state, that's all they want. Okay, they were offered that. By the way, I guarantee you there were individual Palestinians who were like, what are we doing? We can finally have it. I guarantee it. But their leadership said no. Their leadership said no. And so this is not Israel's fault. You can't put that on them. When the people they're negotiating with constantly say no. By the way, Yasser Arafat didn't propose a counteroffer when he said no. I mean, they were expecting even if he said no, he might counteroffer and, we'll negotiate, we'll figure something out. But no, he just said no, and that was it. And again, they were baffled. President Clinton, towards the end of his presidency, whatever you think of him, Yasser Arafat called him to congratulate him and thank you for everything that he had done. He called him a great man, and Bill Clinton says that he stated to him, I am not a great man, I am a failure, and you have made me one. Because this was the big peace deal that he had been touting and saying, hey, well, he was hoping I can leave this legacy. This is the end of my presidency. Everything else that had been happening, for better or worse, that was going on during his presidency, he's like, I can at least do this, right? No. And so he's like, you screwed me over. He actually went on to tell Bush and Colin Powell, when they were coming in, don't trust Yasser Arafat. He's a liar. Specifically told them that. And, they didn't. Bush tried to make a point to get somebody else to be a representative person, leader, for the Palestinian cause. Literally, all right, so this is 1999, 2000, literally as this finishes right here, and it falls apart completely, a second intifada was announced. Bloodier than the first one that had happened in the 80s. The attacks were insane. And not only was it even more deadlier attacks against the Israeli population, any Palestinians who, in my understanding is a good portion of this were usually Christians, although not exclusively, but any Palestinians who had any kind of sympathies or had showed sympathies towards Israel, who were within those areas, oh man, a lot of them died, all right? Reality is, more of them died from their own people during this intifada than Israelis ultimately died from Arabs who were attacking them. The Arab-on-Arab violence was pretty bad during this time. It would eventually erupt into a bad civil war after Hamas would be elected in Gaza. But in any case, before that, this is what was happening. And this is also really important because what we're about to go into from this point on, the people who were children during this on both sides, these are the adults now. The people who were children during that, these are the ones who are fighting. All right? Right now. This is what they remember. This is what they saw. And for when it comes to the Palestinians at this point, any of those, again, who are generally sympathetic, a lot of them found themselves killed. Those who weren't killed and might have had some sympathies were sure not about to show it anymore. Not after they saw some families getting dragged around and slaughtered by their own people. All right? And oddly enough, like a lot of Western nations, we've seen this here in our education systems, Israel throughout the 90s started to do, again, their part in saying, hey, let's make sure that in our history studies and our so on and so forth, that we make sure we have good perspectives brought in from the Palestinian side. Whether you think that's good or not, it's all good if both sides are doing it. But while Israel was doing that, and unfortunately a lot of the leftists in Israel today come from that upbringing, while Israel was doing that, on the Arab side, there wasn't no, in their education, let's make sure we have some of the Jewish perspective to try to get a whole picture of everything that happened. No, on their side, it was Mein Kampf. On their side, it was the Jews are trying to rule the world. On their side, it's the Jews are the enemy. You're a 10-year-old kid. Let's take you to camp, not to play, but to learn how to go ahead and find an Israeli soldier so you can kill him. Yasser Arafat, I want peace. Got a knife by my back. That's sick. They're children. They didn't ask to be born over there. But you have children who are going to be taught that this is their life purpose. It's disgusting. Sorry. All right. Yeah, I'll read that quote. Okay. So this is in the early 2000s. This is a quote that I took from an article, from a Times article in 2001, referencing these events. And it says, for instance, Hamad Abu, a member of the Palestinian Authority appointed of the Fatwa Council, proclaimed live on Palestinian TV, have no mercy on the Jews, no matter where they are. In any country, fight them. Wherever you are, wherever you meet them, kill them. And this is still me quoting from the article. It said, and I agree with it, that's why I put it on here, had an Israeli official uttered such an outrageous provocation against Arabs, the uproar by the UN and the world media would have been deafening. This is in 2001. Okay? 2001. And in fairness, true. And one could say, hey, yeah, it should have been deafening if it was a Jew who was saying such a things, but it should have also been deafening when it was the other side. At this time already, we were seeing a strange thing happening in the media as it involves the issue of Israel, all right, and with the UN, which when the UN had started was generally pro-Israel, but over the decades had only become more and more anti-Israel, all right? So in the 2000s, early 2000s, with that intifada, I picked these three because they were some of the biggest attacks that had happened as it involves against Israel specifically was the Tel Aviv beach attack in 2001, the Jerusalem attack in 2001. These are all before September 11th. And then Passover of 2002. I remember some of these myself, and I'm sure you guys remember too if you were paying attention to the news at the time. Let's see, there was a quote. I forgot to have that open. I wanted to read for that particular one. There it is. All right, so here it is. In 2001, more than 100 Israelis would die at the hands of suicide bombers. Dozens more died in attacks of other sorts. And as the Palestinians grew increasingly brazen, they attacked more heavily trafficked areas, seeking even higher body counts. In the summer of 2001, a suicide bomber attacked the disco at the Tel Aviv beach. I remember seeing this on the news. Which left 21 Israelis dead, most of them teenage girls from Russian families who had immigrated to Israel. Over 100 were injured. Barely 2 months later, a suicide bomber attacked a pizzeria in downtown Jerusalem at one of the city's busiest intersections. 130 people were injured in the blast, and 15 were killed. Half of the dead were children. Eventually, in Passover in 2002, at a hotel where they were going to have the Seder, there was a suicide bombing where over 100 were killed. Again, I picked those because they're some of the biggest attacks, but there were other things that were happening, gunmen, so on and so forth. And again, there were times where you had some Israelis who said, you know what, screw all this. They went and did stuff. But again, what was the difference? Israel would get them, and Israel would prosecute them. Didn't happen on the other side. Never happened on the other side, not once. The double standard. The double standard that's always been applied to Israel. So, with all this continuing to happen, the Israeli left, as it involves politics, with everything they were trying to do in the 90s, found themselves losing because they were like, man, we said we were going to get peace. We said if we do this, we give land for peace, all these things will happen. Well, come to find out, that's not how it worked. That's not how it happened. Israel's government was going through back and forth from centrist to conservative for the next little while. But somewhere in there, we eventually get to the part where Israel said, you know what? We tried making peace with you through negotiating and working. We're going to try something else. One of the stupidest things I've ever done, in my opinion. We're just going to go ahead and unilaterally withdraw from Gaza and give it over to you to do whatever you want. You don't want to, you keep telling us no to a two-state solution, you don't have a choice this time. We're going to give it to you and you're going to make it. That was the idea. It wasn't a bright idea, but it was the idea. So you have the withdrawal from Gaza, where 8,800 Jews who are living in Gaza at this point, some for a few decades, some who were further back, but the majority was there after the 70s when when Egypt said, no, we don't want it back. They were taken out. They were told to leave. Some left because they were told. Many said, no, we're not leaving. So Israel had to send in their police forces and get them. Eventually, even their own IDF by gunpoints for some of these guys to get them out because they didn't want to leave. You understand it, obviously. All right? For better or worse. But this is what they did because they said, no, we're getting you out for multiple reasons. One, we're giving this over to them, and we won't be able to protect you. We can't. We've been doing this in Lebanon. We've been doing this here. We're tired. We're done. We're worn out. We're getting you out, and we're done. We're going to do this with it. Again, I thought that was a bad idea. In any case, they would do this with the hopes of saying, hey, you can't say we didn't try. You have it. You literally have your own place. Do what you want with it. Make something of it. They left agriculture. They left greenhouses, things that the Jews who were there had built up. So many of them with Arab partners who were there as well, built up stuff. But unfortunately, after this withdrawal, to the shock specifically of the left in Israel, not so much to the right or some of the more religious, because they kind of were warning this type of stuff would happen. After that withdrawal, what happened to these things that were left for the people to have the basis of their own economy and try to start something? Well, here's the problem. A Jew had made that, or a Jew was part of the making of that. To their shock, on their televisions, they would see as the Palestinian Arabs burned down the very things that they could have used for their own sake. All right? Greenhouses, agriculture, farmlands, because no, a Jew had started it. One of the Zionists have started this. We don't want any of it. All right? To the shock and the dismay, thinking, maybe if we just do this, they'll finally do something. Nope. Nada. That didn't happen. And so, with this, eventually you would get elections in Gaza. Because again, that was kind of the point. It's like, do your own thing. They saw this, that freaked Israel out. They're like, oh my gosh, the population, obviously. But eventually, Gaza kind of got its act together a little bit, and they made an election. The PA, the Palestinian Authority, which was the continuation of the PLO on a political level, they were in charge of the West Bank, and they said, all right, we got the West Bank, we got this, let's get voting in over there, because we're trying to show the world that we're going to be a democracy and this, that, and the other. They did elections. But here's the thing. Remember what I told you had happened with Lebanon and that withdrawal? Remember what happened with the fact that they did this withdrawal from Gaza. And again, because they were tired and because they just bloodshed and this just kept happening. Who did that embolden? Which mentality did that embolden? Did that embolden a let's have a democracy and make peace mentality? Or did that embolden a hey, let's keep doing what we've been doing? So, who gets voted in to power in Gaza? Hamas. Yes, Hamas. Hamas gets voted into power to the shock of many Israeli. Again, they were those who obviously were saying, hey, this is what we were telling you was going to happen the whole time. So Hamas takes over. And Hamas would run Gaza and continue to that end. They would actually end up having somewhat of a civil war between Hamas and the PA, because the PA was hoping to retain authority. Abbas, I believe, if I remember right, Mohammed Abbas is his name, was the leader of the PA at that time, essentially the successor to Yasser Arafat. And he didn't like that, obviously. This different faction had taken over. And so there was a battle, there was a war. Hamas would win out. But again, they were voted in that area, at least. The West Bank did a little 180 and said we're not going to do another election, because they realized if they did an election there, Hamas would probably win as well. And to this day, the West Bank hasn't had an election for that same reason. The leadership there expects that Hamas would win. And again, that leadership there is generally better than Hamas. It's a low bar, but they are better as it involves interactions with Israel. It's a very, very low bar. But in any case, so with this, we would see the rise of another person. This is someone who I remember reading the articles about and seeing about back in 2006. I was in high school at the time. And I was reminded of it when I was doing research for this a couple months ago, and I came across some articles, and I was like, oh, wow, I remember this person. Miriam Farahat, otherwise known as the Nidal, the mother of struggle, was the first woman voted to the Hamas parliament in Gaza, all right? Women's rights, right? Sorry, I'm being facetious. But most of the Western world was probably looking at this thing, see, look, they're not that bad. They voted a woman into power, and so on and so forth, which, again, anywhere else would be like, hey, that's a good thing. Some people would say no, whatever. But what the Western world was failing to realize was why this woman was voted into power, not because for equality's sake or anything like that. This mother of struggle was known highly and celebrated because of her 6 boys. She sent 3 of them to be suicide bombers. Can you imagine being brought up like that, where your own mother tells you this is your purpose in life? The person who bore you, this is what they teach you for. She was really famous for a video in which showed her instructing her 17-year-old son the best way to take out the most amount of Israelis, who he would then go and do and would be killed. Not before taking, I believe it was 6, it might have been 10, but I want to say 6. 6 Israelis out. For that, she was celebrated. I'm going to read you. This is an article from 2006. It's an ABC News article. I'm going to read this to you. Matter of fact, let me pull out the full article, not just the quote I have, because I want to read a little bit more than that. Here we go. In Gaza, Farahat is known as the Nidal, or the mother of struggle, a mother who sent 3 of her 6 sons on Hamas suicide missions against Israeli targets. She stated, this is her words, "We consider it a holy duty." This is what she told to ABC News when they were interviewing her. "Our land is occupied. You take all the means to banish the occupier. I sacrificed my children for this holy, patriotic duty. I love my children, but as Muslims," it's interesting, there's a but there after I say I love my children, "but as Muslims, we pressure ourselves and sacrifice our emotions for the interest of the homeland. The greater interest takes precedence to the personal interest." Sometimes in our modern faith in churches, even in Messianic synagogues and whatnot, the faith of Yeshua as a whole, with all of its bumps and warts. There is a trend, specifically in the Western world, to talk about how this idea of how your phone becomes your idol, what you spend your time with becomes an idol, and there's a metaphoric truth to this. But even for a person who might spend too much time on their phone, their laptop, maybe watching movies, whatever their thing is, it is not the equivalent of the biblical idol, where you literally praise, literally worship, literally sacrifice your children to Molech. You get what I'm saying? There is a difference. There's one where it's like a type, it's kind of like that, but it's not the same to true pagan worship of a false god, goddess, whatever the case may be. And in this particular case of Allah. What is the difference between the parent who sacrificed their child to Molech or any Baal or any other god, deity, goddess, whatever, and this? Because this is a holy patriotic duty, such that the children I bore, I will gladly sacrifice. Because this is what Allah calls for. Right? She oh my God. She would say later on that also that if necessary, she had 3 other sons who were still alive, and if they needed to, they would follow in their brother's footsteps. How does one deal with a society that has devolved to this? This is the question that, as it involves more secular-minded people, has to be asked. This is the question that, unfortunately, even within the church, has to be asked, as we have so many in the church who are looking at Israel and not grasping what it is they're fighting. Because children dying is a terrible thing. People dying in general in any kind of conflict is a terrible thing. Unfortunately, no matter what kind of war you fight in, it will happen. People died in the fire bombings of Tokyo. Civilians. That was America against Tokyo, World War II. Dresden, that was British and American against the Germans. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands more people died from the fire bombings than they did from the atomic bombs. I'm talking again specifically civilians. Because when you get to a certain point of total war, that's what starts to happen. And that was that kind of war. When you're fighting a war, now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, I apologize, but when you're fighting a war against a people who will gladly take their children and turn them into combatants and dare you to shoot, what do you do? Can you also imagine for that? I mean, people love to make it sound like Israel are monsters. Look at our soldiers who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. You realize what that does to your mind when you find yourself in a situation where you're yelling, "Kid, do not pick that up." And they pick it up. And now you have to choose between shooting a child or letting yourself or your brothers in arms next to you getting shot. Realize what type of terrible, terrible dilemma you're in? But that's the reality. People want to talk about what the best answers are for that. There is no best answer for that. It's sick. But whose fault is it? Was it the Israeli soldiers' fault? Was it the Israeli government's fault? Who's sponsoring that? Who's teaching their kids to do that? But no, it's Israel. It's Israel. It's Israel. It's Israel. This is a mentality that I cannot ever fathom or understand. Is Israel perfect? No. Have there been, specifically in the military, Israeli soldiers who are psychotic and themselves deserve to be in a jail cell or put to death? Sure. And some of them who probably weren't? Yes. But that is not the same or even close to being equivalent to a society in which on every level is doing that. people want to talk about breaking of international laws and so on and so forth. Taking a child and turning them into a combatant is quite literally a war crime according to the UN. For whatever it's worth, whatever the UN is worth, that is a war crime. Which is to say, for decades, that's a war crime that's been being committed year to year. Where's the outrage? Yet, how many resolutions come against Israel? Sorry, I apologize. I got a little ahead of myself there. But I mean, the reality is there's innocent people on both sides that are suffering, and it's not because of Israel that they're suffering. And that's the problem today, because everything is their fault. So the aftermath of all of this, from that point on, was now that a known terrorist group who was continuing at that time to declare war, not recognize Israel, to say that the whole thing needs to be destroyed again, Hamas's charter, has taken over Gaza, electing people like Nudal into their parliament. Israel does what any sane nation, I don't care what nation it is, would do when such a group takes over the area that's not even a mile away from your land. They blockaded. It wasn't just them. Egypt did the same thing. Built a blockade. They started to build up walls. They did the same thing all around the West Bank because of what was happening there. Building those security fences and walls as a means of saying, no, we're not going to allow this. All right? We tried. Look what happened. They literally got the two-state they wanted. Look what happened. So Israel started to do that, making a big blockade. Anything that could potentially be used for military arms, they tried to do their best to keep from being brought in. However, as has been shown, tunnels were built and things were still brought in, as also demonstrated by the fact that from pretty much the point that Hamas fully took over Gaza by 2008 and after, almost every 2 to 3 years would be a nice little, hey, hello, we're here, we're going to shoot rockets at you. Almost every 2 to 3 years. Sometimes in the thousands, the amount that they would shoot. Trying to show restraints, Israel would keep from doing too much, but eventually enough would be enough, and they would go in, much to the world's dismay. It was Israel's fault. Israel was attacked, Israel retaliated, but somehow it was their fault. Somehow they were the ones that resolutions would be built up against. Even before October 7th, calls of genocide were being labeled against Israel for what they were doing. All right? An open-air prison, and so on and so forth. And again, they did make a blockade. There's some truth to some of that aspect. But again, why? Why did they make a blockade? Which again, Egypt joined in on. So, during all this time, billions of dollars was sent to originally under the PLO and then eventually even Hamas, as involves specifically the Gaza Strip, and foreign aid. A lot of this over the span of a decade, upwards of, let's see, what was about 25 or 30 billion, at least what we know of anyway, and that's the number I will quote. Upwards of that was given over. Unfortunately, rather than using this for the betterment of their people, it was utilized for the indoctrination of a whole generation of Palestinians, again, most specifically at this point in Gaza Strip, even if that was happening on some level in the West Bank. Again, like I said, low bar, but the PA is overall better than Hamas, generally speaking. But, yeah, so now you also have this, just like that lady, people being brought up, this is what they do at their camps, this is what they get taught, this is all this being infiltrated into the young minds of these young boys and girls. That your whole life's purpose is to kill as many Jews as you can. The Muslim propaganda campaign has reached heights unknown, thanks in large part to the general leftist framework that has permeated Western civilization. Two different things that have somehow come together to form something unique. But in a more surprising twist, a resurgence of, as we get to today, of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish sentiment has been slowly brewing on the conservative side, specifically as it involves Western society, and again here specifically in the United States. And we are seeing before our very eyes the context for how the world turns in full. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we're seeing in full against Israel leading into the end times. It is my belief that that is what we have been seeing develop over the last decades, and even more so in the last 2 decades. You guys heard me say this before as we're finishing up on this, that me and my wife used to have conversations because, as like I said, the UN, the resolutions, and this and that and the other, but as it involved people generally when these things were happening in 2010, 12, 14, and whatnot, you'd have waves of the usual protest against Israel, for better or worse. You have people that come out and say stuff. You had the political rhetoric, but it would die out. It would generally die out, and the protests would only last for so long. And looking at those things, me and Nina would talk and say, what will happen that the world will turn? Because while you have groups, specific groups, it's not as general, or so it seemed, amongst everybody, especially in the Western world, as being anti-Israel or anti-Jewish. In the Western world, if something were to happen, eventually you'd have other protests and people come out, especially in the United States, where, hey, that was anti-Semitic rhetoric, and people would apologize. Unfortunately, even if they just said something might have not been fully anti-Semitic. And then eventually I would apologize, or whatever the case may be, or some would anyway, because of the pressure that would come about. But then October 7th happened. And literally, that morning I did the teaching on the feast. I believe I was focusing on the fall feast in general, a morning here when we were at the other building. By that night into the next days, it wasn't just that there were protests, which was expected. It was the level of protest, but it was also the level of protest, and Israel hadn't even retaliated yet. The level of protest after 1,200 people were slaughtered and killed, and also hostages taken. They hadn't even retaliated yet, and I was seeing protests. Charges of genocide already then. Within the next couple weeks, only seeing that grow further and further on college campuses or throughout the United States to a degree that hadn't been seen. If we're honest, y'all, some of you, most of you are older than me, you've seen it. You've seen protests. You've seen some violent protests. But what would happen? Whole colleges being taken over, encampments and so on and so forth, before they even retaliated. They had just been sucker punched. They hadn't even retaliated yet, and people were already calling them out for doing what? They hadn't even done anything yet. And then, unlike no other military in the world, not just then, but in all the battles before that, as technology has developed and so on and so forth, Israel warning, giving leaflets, letting people know when they're going to strike an area, telling people to evacuate. So no other military does this. None. There's actually a good argument to say you shouldn't do it, because the strategy of saying, hey, we're about to bomb this place, get out to the civilians, also lets the other people know that you're trying to get. And there can be plenty of debate and argument about the manner in which Israel has done this particular war, the one that's happening now, and methods and what was the best way, and should they have done this specific thing, this, that, and the other. But just like with everything else, one of the main points and arguments to remember is they didn't start this. They have tried. They have desperately tried to bring about peace, saying we can do a two-state thing. You can have it. And to the point where they went out of their way and said, you know what, we'll just withdraw ourselves and you do something with it. Who else has ever done that? But remember, it's Israel's fault. So, yeah. I got a little sidetracked there with some parts that I said. I apologize. But that is where we're at. Ultimately, and this is the big thing to end on, we know how this ends. We know God wins. But I am not going to act like I am not saddened at the reality of what I'm seeing. Where even in something like the Messianic movement, which is supposed to be the full-on marriage of reuniting with those roots, even in that movement of all things, I hear and I see the continuation of conspiracies that are as old as the medieval ages. It's the Jews, it's this, it's that, it's others. And again, it's not as if all Jews are good. I've said it. It's not as if there aren't leftist Jews, like someone like a George Soros and so on and so forth. People like that. And every time I hear someone say, well, you got someone like George Soros who does this, that, and the other. Yeah, and he's from a Jewish background, yeah. What about the other people? What about the black people? What about the white people? What about the Spanish people that are a part of those groups? Are we going to label all of those groups because of those individuals? No, but we will label who. Why? See, understand the sickness that is, because it is spiritual. And it's something I've seen here too. It is something that needs to be dealt with. Okay? That's that double standard. And that's the double standard that's your first clue in that maybe, just maybe, you're having thoughts that aren't right. Or you're listening to something that's not right. All right? I know there are some, I'm sorry, I'm going to do this. I know there are some who like listening to someone like a Candace Owens. And listen, I want you to understand, if you don't know already, something that I've already said to some people, as it involves Candace, watch for things that she will eventually say. And just this last weekend, in reference to a messianic Jewish rabbi, called his whole faith a deception. Understand, this is something I've already warned some people about, that this would eventually happen. She is not who you think she is. Okay? All right? But she called out this messianic rabbi in their little dispute, I believe it was on Twitter or something else. He was essentially saying that, listen, all the things you're saying about Jews as a general statement, understand that your Messiah is a Jew. And ultimately, it's a Jew in that sense that you will end up bending the knee to. That's all he was saying. And her response was essentially along the lines of, it is a deception which you believe, it's heretical, and so on and so forth, right? We looked at church history, went over this. I talked about specifically in modern times, a specific Catholic group, the SPPX, which I can't say for sure she's 100% a part of, but man, her way of thinking tends to roll with it. Whether she fully is a part of that group or not, I don't know. But regardless, the theology is the same, and that is a very, very bad group when it comes to this kind of stuff. But there's a lot of people, specifically amongst Gentiles within the Messianic movement, who, listen, I get it. There are things we've seen, we're very cynical of certain stuff because of even what we've seen within the church. But nuance. Remember nuance. Remember the complexity of things. Don't fall into the generalizations. And be careful with people when they say, oh, I'm just asking questions. Satan was just asking questions. Did he really? Did he really say, I'm just asking a question, right? All right. I apologize. I know that might upset some people what I just said. All right. Guys, I love y'all. God bless you. This is the end of the series. Next time, hopefully, that I'm up here doing a Torah talk, I want to be able to do something more biblical and focus on reading of the Bible. But this was necessary and it had to be done. So I love you guys. And yeah, that's it. We'll open up for any questions, discussions. We'll try to do what we've been, yes, sir. Try to do what we've been doing where if you got a question, just, come on up in case we got a line.